One man's dream of conquering the world started with a single step onto a foreign shore and ended in a sea of fire. In 1592, the largest invading force the world had ever seen landed in Korea, not just to take a kingdom, but to bring an empire to its knees. Yet, as the capital fell and a king fled, the fate of East Asia came to rest on the shoulders of one disgraced commander and his legendary iron monsters. This is the story of the Imjin War, a 7-year apocalypse where samurai, Ming warriors, and turtle ships collided to change the course of history forever. The unifier's ambition. What happens to a nation of warriors when the war finally ends? For over a century, Japan was a slaughterhouse, a fractured land of daimyo and samurai locked in a cycle of endless bloodletting, known as the Sengoku Jidai. But by 1590, the smoke had cleared, and one man stood above the ruins, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He had done the impossible. He had unified Japan. Yet, standing at the peak of his power, Hideyoshi faced a terrifying realization. He was the master of 500,000 battle-hardened soldiers who knew nothing but the art of killing. If he didn't give them a war abroad, they would surely start one at home. Have you ever wondered how far ambition can push a man before it turns into madness? Hideyoshi didn't just want to maintain his grip on Japan. He looked across the sea at the Ming Dynasty of China and saw a prize worthy of his ego. But to reach the dragon, he first had to step over the tiger. He sent a chilling ultimatum to the Joseon court of Korea. Join me in my conquest of China, or be the first to fall. To Hideyoshi, Korea was merely a bridge, a path to be walked upon. He viewed the Korean people not as a sovereign nation, but as an obstacle in the way of his ultimate destiny. The Korean response was one of disbelief and quiet defiance. For 200 years, the Joseon dynasty had enjoyed a golden age of peace, art, and Neo-Confucian philosophy. While Japan had been refining the arquebus and the siege tower, Korea had been perfecting the brush and the poem. Their military was a shadow of its former self, its forts crumbling, and its generals more accustomed to court politics than the screams of a battlefield. How could a nation of scholars hope to withstand the sudden fury of a nation of professional killers? Hideyoshi's plan was as audacious as it was logistically insane. He mobilized an invasion force of 150,000 men, the largest expeditionary force the world had seen to that point, dwarfing the Spanish Armada that had set sail just 4 years prior. These were men who had spent their entire lives in armor, led by commanders who had survived the most brutal civil wars in history. They weren't just coming to occupy it, they were coming to dismantle a world. As the sun rose over the Tsushima Strait in the spring of 1592, the horizon darkened with the sails of thousands of Japanese ships. Hideyoshi stayed behind in Japan, watching from his golden castle, convinced that the conquest of Asia would be a matter of weeks. But as the first samurai stepped onto the beaches of Busan, a terrifying question hung in the air. Can a culture of peace survive a collision with a culture of total war? The bridge Hideyoshi sought to walk across was about to become a graveyard, and the first screams of the Imjin War were about to echo across the Yalu River. The fall of the dragon. What do you do when the world you have known for 2 centuries vanishes in just 20 days? On May 23, 1592, the people of Busan looked out at the horizon and saw not a fleet, but a forest of masts. Within hours, the city was a charnel house. The Japanese did not fight like the raiders the Koreans were used to. They fought with a terrifying, synchronized brutality. While the Korean defenders relied on the traditional bower weapon of grace and precision, the samurai brought the tanagashima, the matchlock musket. Imagine the psychological horror of a soldier who has never seen gunpowder weaponry, standing on a wall as a volley of lead tears through his ranks before he can even draw his string. Can you picture the chaos of a defense collapsing, not through lack of courage, but through a total technological eclipse? The invasion wasn't a crawl, it was a sprint. The Japanese commandersmen like Konishi Yukinaga and Kato Kiyomizu were in a literal race to see who could capture the capital first. They moved with a speed that defied the geography of the Korean peninsula, covering 20 miles a day through rugged mountain passes. The Joseon court in Hanyang, modern-day Seoul, was paralyzed. They had spent so long debating whether an invasion was even possible that they had no plan for when it actually arrived. When the elite Korean cavalry, the pride of the northern frontier, met the Japanese at the Battle of Tanjimde, they expected a glorious charge. Instead, they were lured into a marsh and systematically picked off by musketeers. In a single afternoon, the last line of professional defense for the capital was erased. Have you ever considered what happens to the soul of a nation when its leader disappears? As the Japanese drew near Hanyang, King Xianzhou made a choice that would haunt his legacy forever. He fled. He abandoned the palace of great brightness, leaving his people to face the samurai alone. When the citizens saw the royal procession sneaking out of the city gates in the middle of a torrential rainstorm, their grief turned to a white-hot rage. They didn't wait for the Japanese to burn the city. The Korean people burned the government offices themselves, destroying the slave records and the symbols of a state that had failed them. When the Japanese finally marched into Seoul, expecting a grand confrontation, they found a city already in ashes and a throne that was empty. The speed of the Japanese victory was actually their first great mistake. They had captured the capital, they had pushed the king all the way to the Chinese border, and they held the main roads. On paper, Korea had fallen, but the Japanese were used to the rules of Sengoku Japan. You killed the lord, you take the castle, and the land is yours. They didn't realize that in Korea, the land was not the king, and the king was not the land. As the Japanese lines of communication stretched thinner and thinner, snaking hundreds of miles back to the coast, they began to feel a chill in the air. They were the masters of the cities, but the mountains and the forests were starting to whisper. And more importantly, while they dominated the land, they had forgotten one crucial reality. Every soldier they had, every grain of rice they ate, and every bullet they fired had to cross a narrow stretch of water that was no longer safe. Ghost of the sea. What if the fate of an entire civilization rested on a man who had never seen a naval battle until he was in his 40s? While the Hosein armies were being shattered on land, a silent storm was brewing in the southern waters. Admiral Yi Sun-sin was not a product of the high seas tradition. He was a man of discipline and logistics who had spent much of his career on the northern frontiers. Yet he understood a fundamental truth that the Japanese generals, in their rush for glory, had ignored. An army is like a body, and the sea is its jugular vein. If you sever the vein, the body dies, no matter how strong its limbs are. Can you imagine the audacity of a commander who, with only a handful of ships, decided to challenge the naval might of a global superpower? The Japanese Navy was designed for the only kind of sea warfare they knew: boarding. Their strategy was simple: pull alongside, throw the grappling hooks, and let the samurai do what they did best. But Yi Sun-sin changed the rules of the game entirely. He utilized the Panaxian, a sturdy, multi-decked ship that sat high in the water, turning it into a floating fortress. But his true masterpiece was the Jubaxian, the legendary turtle ship. Picture a vessel completely encased in iron-spiked plating, with a dragon's head that spewed noxious smoke and cannon fire. It was a prehistoric tank on the water, designed to ram into the heart of a Japanese fleet, immune to boarding and terrifying to behold. How do you fight a monster that you cannot touch, but which can shatter your wooden hull with a single broadside? At the Battle of Hansen Island, Yi Sun-sin executed a maneuver that would be studied by naval tacticians for centuries: the crane wing formation. He lured the Japanese fleet into open water. Then suddenly his ships fanned out in a massive arc, surrounding the enemy and crossing their T. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Japanese were trapped in a circle of fire, their ships splintering under the superior range and power of Korean cannons. By the time the smoke cleared, the Japanese dream of a quick conquest was dead in the water. They had the land, but they had lost the sea. And without the sea, there were no more bullets, no more reinforcements, and no more food for the 150,000 men sitting in the ruins of Seoul. The psychological impact was devastating. For the first time, the invincible samurai felt the cold grip of isolation. They were stranded in a hostile land, surrounded by a population that hated them, with a ghost stalking the waters behind them. Every time a Japanese sailor looked toward the horizon, he wasn't looking for prizes. He was looking for the dragon-headed prows of Yi Sun-sin's fleet. But as the Japanese began to starve and retreat into their fortifications, a new shadow began to fall over the northern horizon. The bridge was no longer just a path. For Japan it had become a doorway for a sleeping giant. If Korea was the tiger, what would happen when the dragon finally decided to wake up? The celestial intervention. What happens when a border is no longer a line on a map, but a floodgate holding back a tsunami? As King Xianzhou reached the banks of the Yalu River, he wasn't just a king in exile. He was a man knocking on the door of the most powerful empire on earth. The Ming Dynasty of China, the Celestial Empire, looked down upon the rest of the world as a collection of tribute-paying children. But now, one of those children was screaming for help, and the fire in Korea was beginning to lick at China's own front door. Have you ever wondered how a local conflict escalates into a world war? For the Ming, The question wasn't whether Korea was worth saving, it was whether they wanted to fight the samurai in the mountains of Pyongyang or on the streets of Beijing. The initial Ming response was one of deep suspicion. They had seen Korea fall so quickly that they suspected a trap. Was Korea actually conspiring with Japan to lure the Ming army into an ambush? It was only when the reality of the Japanese brutality became undeniable that the dragon finally stirred. But when the Ming arrived, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought a different philosophy of destruction. While the Japanese excelled in the intimacy of the sword and the precision of the musket, the Ming brought the thunder of heavy artillery and the crushing weight of massed cavalry. In early 1593, a Ming army of nearly 50,000 men, led by General Yi Sun-sin, marched south to reclaim Pyongyang. Imagine the sight. Tens of thousands of Ming warriors, their armor gleaming in the winter sun, accompanied by great general cannons that could shatter stone walls from a mile away. The siege of Pyongyang was a collision of two military superpowers. The Japanese, entrenched within the city walls, found that their muskets, so effective against the Korean infantry, were no match for the long-range devastation of Chinese gunpowder. As the Ming cannons roared, the walls of Pyongyang didn't just break, they disintegrated. Have you ever felt the shift in momentum when a bully suddenly meets someone bigger? The Japanese were forced into a desperate, bloody retreat. They realized, for the first time, that they were not just fighting a broken kingdom, but the entire weight of the Asian continent. But this intervention came with a terrifying price for the Korean people. The Ming were not liberators in the modern sense. They were an imperial force. They lived off the land, often seizing what little food the Korean peasants had left after the Japanese had already looted it. Korea had become a massive chessboard where two giants were moving pieces, and the Korean people were the ones being crushed beneath the board. As the Japanese retreated toward the south, back toward the coastal forts they called Wyo, a grim stalemate began to settle over the peninsula. The blitzkrieg was over. The war of movement had become a war of attrition. But while the professional armies of the Ming and the shogunate stared each other down across a scorched landscape, a new, more dangerous force was rising from the ashes of the Korean countryside. If the king had fled and the generals had failed, who was left to defend the soil? The People's War. Can a nation truly be conquered if its people refuse to be governed? While the Ming and Japanese generals were locked in a diplomatic stalemate, negotiating behind the scenes to carve up the Korean peninsula like a piece of fruit, the Korean people were writing a different story in blood. The Japanese had expected the peasantry to bow as their lords had. In the Sengoku tradition, when the castle falls, the village submits. But they were about to discover a concept they were entirely unprepared for: the Yubyong, or the righteous armies. Have you ever wondered what happens when a scholar drops his brush, a farmer drops his plow, and a monk drops his beads to pick up a blade? This was not a professional military. It was a grassroots uprising of the soul. Leading them were men like Kwak Jae-yu, a wealthy scholar who spent his entire family fortune to raise a militia. He became a living nightmare for the Japanese, known as the red-robed general because he wore his wife's scarlet silk into battle, taunting the samurai from the tree line. The Yubyong didn't fight in the open fields where the Japanese muskets could find them. They fought in the shadows of the mountains, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to turn the Korean landscape into a labyrinth of death. They burned supply depots, cut off messengers, and vanished into the mist before a single katana could be drawn. Can you feel the mounting frustration of a professional samurai, trained for honorable combat, being picked off by a hidden archer in a forest he doesn't understand? But perhaps the most striking defenders of the realm were the warrior monks. In a society where Buddhism had been marginalized by the Neo-Confucian elite, thousands of monks took up arms under the leadership of the elderly master Huzhong. These Samyong warriors didn't fight for political power or royal favor. They fought to defend the very ground they walked upon. Imagine the sight of a saffron-robed monk wielding a massive staff or a curved blade, standing side by side with a ragged farmer and a disgraced nobleman. This was a total mobilization of a culture of people as war, centuries before the term was even coined. The turning point for this irregular force came at the Battle of Hangzhou. A small force of 2,300 Koreans, including monks and even women carrying stones in their skirts, faced a Japanese assault of 30,000 veterans. They used everything at their disposal: boiling water, massive stones, and the terrifying Watcher multi-rocket launcher that could fire 100 fire arrows in a single volley. The Japanese were repulsed with staggering losses. It was a message to the world. The professional army might have been broken, but the nation was very much alive. As the years of the first invasion ground to a halt, a fragile truce was called. The Japanese retreated to the coast, and the Ming returned to their borders. For a few years, there was a ghost of a peacetime of failed diplomacy and bitter negotiations. But Hideyoshi, sitting in his palace, growing increasingly paranoid and frail, wasn't done. He felt the sting of humiliation. He didn't want a stalemate. He wanted a legacy. And in 1597, he would launch a second wave of such concentrated cruelty that it would leave a scar on East Asia that is unfully healed even today. If the first invasion was about conquest, what happens when the second becomes about revenge? The second wave. How do you measure the cost of a wounded ego? After years of stalemate and diplomatic theater, the peace was shattered, not by a strategic necessity, but by a fit of rage. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi realized that the Ming emperor intended to invest him as a vassal rather than recognize him as an equal, he didn't just order a new invasion, he ordered a purge. In 1597, 140,000 Japanese soldiers returned to Korean shores, but the mission had changed. If the first invasion was a campaign of conquest, the second was a campaign of punishment. Have you ever considered what happens when a military force stops trying to win the hearts of the people and starts trying to erase their existence? This phase of the war was characterized by a level of systemic brutality that horrified even the veteran Ming observers. To prove their success to a distant and increasingly unstable Hideyoshi, Japanese commanders began a grim harvest. Since transporting heads back to Japan was logistically impossible, they settled for a smaller trophy, noses and ears. To this day, in Kyoto, there stands the Mimizukatha, mound of ears containing the remains of tens of thousands of Koreans. This wasn't just war. It was an attempt to break the spirit of a civilization through sheer, calculated atrocity. Can you imagine the psychological toll on a population where every village lived in the shadow of such a quota? Tactically, the Japanese had learned from their previous mistakes. Instead of racing for the capital, they focused on securing the southern provinces, building a chain of massive stone fortresses, known as Waiyo. These were not mere temporary camps. They were masterpieces of Sengoku engineering, designed to be impregnable. But while the Japanese were digging in, the Korean defense suffered its most self-inflicted wound. Through a web of court intrigue and Japanese double-agents, the legendary Admiral Yi Sun-sin was framed for treason. He was stripped of his rank, tortured, and forced to serve as a common soldier. Think about the irony. The man who had saved the kingdom was now walking in the mud, while the fleet he had built was handed over to a political rival. The result was the greatest naval disaster in Korean history, the Battle of Chilchiliang. Without Ye's brilliance, the Korean fleet was lured into a trap and almost entirely annihilated. In a single night, the naval supremacy that had kept the Japanese at bay for years vanished into the depths of the sea. Only 12 ships escaped the carnage. With the Korean Navy gone and the Ming reinforcements struggling to crack the new Japanese fortresses, the peninsula was once again on the brink of total collapse. The Japanese were no longer just a bridge to China. They were a permanent, festering occupation. As the winter of 1597 approached, the situation looked bleaker than it ever had at the start of the war. The king was in despair, the people were starving, and the sea belonged to the samurai. But in the darkest hour of the Joseon dynasty, a messenger arrived with a single piece of news that would change everything. The commoner general, the man they had broken and humiliated, was being called back to lead what was left of his country. But what can one man do with 12 broken ships against an empire? The final hour. How do you face a wall of 300 ships with only 13? This is the question Admiral Yi Sun-sin faced at the Battle of Myeongyang, perhaps the most impossible naval stand in human history. Reinstated to his command after his predecessor's disastrous defeat, Yi found his fleet reduced to a handful of battered vessels and a demoralized crew. The Japanese, sensing a final victory, converged on the Munyang Strait with overwhelming force. But Yi understood something they didn't. The strait was a bottleneck with a terrifying secret. The tide there shifted with such violence that the water literally roared, creating whirlpools that could swallow a ship whole. Have you ever wondered if a single person's resolve could actually bend the laws of probability? He didn't just fight, he stood alone. At the start of the battle, his flagship was the only one to charge forward, while his other captains hovered in the rear, paralyzed by fear. For hours, Ye's lone ship held the line against dozens of Japanese vessels, using his superior cannons to keep them at bay. When the tide finally turned, the Japanese fleet was thrown into chaos. their ships crashing into one another in the narrow, churning waters. Yi seized the moment. By the end of the day, 30 Japanese ships were at the bottom of the strait, and the rest were in full retreat. Against all odds, the ghost of the sea had returned, and the Japanese supply lines were once again severed. The psychological impact was a death blow to the Japanese campaign. They realized that as long as Yi Sun-sin drew breath, they could never truly own Korea. As 1598 dawned, the Japanese position became untenable. But the end of the war didn't come from a battlefield. It came from a sickbed in Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who had ignited this continental fire, was dying. His final words were a frantic command to bring his soldiers home. "Do not let my men become ghosts in a foreign land." But for many, it was too late. As the Japanese began their massive evacuation, the combined Ming and Korean fleets moved in for the kill. They weren't going to let the invaders simply walk away. The final act took place at the Battle of North. It was a midnight engagement, a chaotic swirl of fire, wood, and screams under a moonless sky. It was here that the war claimed its most tragic price. In the heat of the battle, a stray Japanese bullet found its mark, striking Admiral Yi Sun-sin. As he lay dying on the deck of his ship, he commanded his nephew to hide his body with a shield and continue beating the war drum. "Do not let them know I am dead," he whispered. He died as he had lived, a shield for a nation that had often failed him. When the sun rose, the Japanese fleet was shattered, and the Imjin War was over. But as the survivors looked at the horizon, they realized the world they were returning to was gone forever. Shadows of the past, 7 years, 2 invasions, millions dead. When the last Japanese sail disappeared over the horizon in 1598, the silence that fell over the Korean peninsula was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a graveyard. The Imjin War was over, but its ghost was just beginning to haunt the future of East Asia. Have you ever considered how a single conflict can rewire the DNA of entire civilizations? The world that existed before 1592 was gone, replaced by a landscape of trauma, shifting borders, and a deep-seated bitterness that still pulses beneath the surface of modern geopolitics. For Korea, the cost was almost beyond calculation. The Joseon dynasty survived, but it was a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Over 80% of its arable land had been devastated, and its population had been decimated by combat, famine, and plague. But something else had changed: the Korean identity. They had seen their king flee and their professional army crumble. Yet they had also seen farmers and monks rise to defend the soil when the state could not. The righteous armies became a blueprint for Korean resistance that would resurface centuries later during the Japanese occupation of the 20th century. How does a nation rebuild when its very soil is soaked in the blood of a people's war? In Japan, the war's end triggered a seismic political collapse. Hideyoshi had gambled the wealth and manpower of the nation on a dream of empire, and he had lost. With his death and the failure of the campaign, the power vacuum was absolute. Within 2 years, the Battle of Sekigahara would decide the fate of Japan, leading to the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. The new masters of Japan looked at the wreckage of the Imjin War and chose a radical new path: Sengoku, or national isolation. They closed their doors to the world for 250 years, haunted by the cost of Hideyoshi's overreach. They realized that the bridge to the continent was a two-way street, one that brought back nothing but death and debt. Even the mighty Ming Dynasty, the dragon that had come to Korea's rescue, found itself mortally wounded. The astronomical cost of the intervention, millions of silver taels and tens of thousands of elite troops, bankrupted the imperial treasury and weakened the northern borders. This exhaustion created an opening for a new power in the north, the Manchus. Within a few decades, the Ming would fall, replaced by the Qing dynasty. The Imjin War didn't just break Korea, it acted as the catalyst for the fall of the greatest empire on earth. Today, the legacy of the Imjin War lives on in the monuments, the folk heroes, and the scars of memory. We see it in the statues of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, standing guard in the heart of Seoul, and we hear it in the political tensions that still flare between Tokyo and its neighbors. It was a war of firsts, the first global-scale conflict in East Asia, the first use of ironclad-style vessels, and the first time a civilian population rose up in total resistance. As we look back at the sea of fire that engulfed the 16th century, we are left with a final, haunting question. If the Imjin War taught us that ambition can destroy empires and that one man's courage can save a kingdom, why does the world keep trying to build bridges out of swords?